Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to our first webinar on the use of force policy. This is a webinar intended to gather feedback on our current use of force policy and kind of see what the community wants in that policy. So to introduce myself, I'm Colby Dolly. I'm a lieutenant with the St. Louis County Police Department. I've been with the department about 20 years in a variety of capacities. Started as patrolman, was an academy instructor, a sergeant in the city of Jennings for a little bit, and now I'm the lieutenant over the Bureau of Research and Analysis. So in that bureau, we are sort of overseeing all of the policies, policy development, if anything needs changed, and also with accreditation. So most of you have probably heard of CALIA accreditation. We also are in charge of monitoring that and making sure that we are in compliance with CALIA. And the two, with the policy and the CALIA accreditation, kind of go hand in hand because policy is oftentimes directed by the accreditation standards. So I'm going to switch over here just for a second to a PowerPoint, and we'll kind of guide you through what we're going to be doing today. Give me just a moment here. Share my screen. And hopefully somebody could give me a thumbs up or a raise their hand or something that you can see that. Maybe one of the panelists. Okay, looks like a lot of people are. Okay, thank you for that. All right, let me get my annotator going here and we'll get started. Okay, so first of all, I want to introduce some other panelists that we have with us today. So also on this webinar is Sergeant Justin Nichols. Sergeant Nichols is a sergeant in the Diversity and Inclusion Unit. He's got a wide variety of experiences on the department, worked in patrol in a couple different precincts, and now he's looking at different policies and practices that have to deal with diversity and inclusion. We have Miss Vera Cully. She is our social media coordinator. She's been with the department for about 6 years now. She handles all of our Facebook, Twitter, a lot of our website stuff, the majority of our website content. And then we also have Officer Kim Miner. She works as a colleague of mine in the Bureau of Research and Analysis. So the goals today are we want to familiarize you with the current use of force policy. So that's going to be sort of the first half of this, I guess we'll call it this, the webinar. That'll be more of a presentation. And then we also want to familiarize you with some current trends with use of force. So this is really just going over sort of some of our use of force stats, not super in depth, but we at least want to give you some idea of sort of what we're talking about when it comes to outcomes with use of force. And then the last part of this webinar will be what you probably came here for, and that is to listen to feedback from attendees on the current policy and then also suggestions for change. So whatever you believe that the policy should be, if you have an opinion on that, this is a forum that you can do that. So let me go to my next slide here. So kind of the ground rules, and we just need to sort of cover this to know what to expect. So as I go through the presentation, I'm going to call it, so I have this PowerPoint and I'm going to go through the policy. You're actually going to see the policy as it looks on paper. I'm going to have that up on the screen, and I'm not going to go over everything word for word, line by line. That'd be pretty boring and monotonous, but I'm going to hit the major highlights. So you sort of get a good feel for what the policy is and the features of the policy. So during that session, if you have a question, feel free to ask a question in the dialog box. If you look at the bottom of my screen, that's what you should see at the bottom of your screen. So in the Q&A, if you want to type in a question there, if you have a specific question about what we're covering in the policy during that presentation, I'll try to answer that. If we get too many of them, we might have to hold them till the end, but hopefully we can do this almost like a classroom setting. When we then get to the feedback portion, so when we're done looking at the policy and the stats, then you're going to have a couple options to give your feedback or give your commentary. And those are, you can still use a question and answer. So if you don't want to speak live in front of an audience, so to speak, in the webinar, you can still just ask a question or give a comment in the question and answer section. It's perfectly fine. If you would like to speak, you can raise your hand, and then one of the panelists, my colleagues, will unmute you, and you'll have 3 minutes to give your commentary, your opinion, whatever it is you want to say. I will say that I understand that, especially with a topic like this, there's a lot of nuance to this topic. There's a lot of things that we could talk about. We could probably spend all day talking about this. So if 3 minutes isn't enough, I totally understand, but we still have to cap it at have a reasonable amount of time. So if you have further comments, you can email them to policycomment@stlouisco.com. That's always an option for you. You can email your comments to that even if you don't speak live, even if you don't ask a question in a question and answer session. Perfectly fine. Those emails actually come to me, and so I will look at those. My policy team will look at those. We'll take those into consideration. And of course, just have to put this out here as a disclaimer, I have no intention to stifle First Amendment rights or to not let people comment, but we do reserve the right to prohibit inappropriate, offensive, or vulgar language or speech during the webinar, of course, just to make it professional. And so it's nice and clean for everybody. And just as a reminder, this session is being recorded. One of the main reasons for that is we can go back and we can look at these comments, hear these comments again to make sure that we got them right. Okay, so with that, we will then go to the actual policy. I want to point out here that the policy that we're looking at today, I pulled directly from our website. So anyone can go to this website and they can pull this down for themselves, look at it anytime. And later when we get to the stats, same thing with that. You can go to the website, you can find that, look at that for yourself. All right, so the use of force policy. So a couple things to point out here. This policy has been in effect since April 7th, 2010. So it's a good 10 years old now. It's got a little bit of age on it. But just because you see April 7th, 2010, that doesn't mean that we haven't updated this. And what I mean by that is we review these policies constantly. That's part of CALIA accreditation, is you have to review these annually, at least these important policies like this. So this is getting reviewed quite often internally, but then also every time we have a CALIA accreditation, it's also getting reviewed by the accreditation team. We've had a couple other sort of studies of the department over the years too. Department of Justice came in a few years ago, looked at it. Center for Policing Equity has looked at it. So this has been reviewed many, many times. Not to say that it's perfect, but it does have all the key components that you'd want in a modern use of force policy. With all that said, of course, there are things that we want to improve upon it. That's one of the reasons why we're here right now doing this webinar. So the first thing I want to point out here is the policy jumps sort of right into the use of deadly force regulations. And so these are pretty straightforward. And basically you have here in section B, these are the things that authorize an officer to use deadly force. The suspect committed or attempted to commit a felony, and it involved the use or threatened use of deadly force. And there is a substantial risk that the fleeing suspect will cause death or serious physical injury if apprehension is delayed. So all of these, this is actually pretty standard across the country. This comes from a couple different court cases. Tennessee versus Garner, Graham versus Connor are the two main ones for that. So this is sort of standard language you see throughout the United States. The policy then goes into the use of non-deadly force. And I should say that the use of non-deadly force is actually way more common as opposed to deadly force. Deadly force, although it is, publicized quite often and extensively, and not to say it shouldn't be, but it does sort of pale in comparison as far as the frequency compared to non-deadly use of force. The one thing that I do want to point out here with this non-deadly use of force is the policy does mention that there should be de-escalation in here. So we do have a little bit of that saying that the officers should de-escalate to bring it under control in a safe manner. And then also, and this will be covered later, but if you look at this last line here, the officers are not authorized to use chokeholds, neck restraints, shoulder pins, or similar weaponless control techniques. So that came up obviously after the George Floyd incident about these chokeholds. just so you know, that's been on our policy, I think, since about 2005. It's been in there for quite a while that you can't use any type of chokeholds, neck restraints. The intent here is just to cover sort of a whole gamut of things that we could call some type of chokehold. Let's see, go to the next slide here. So in this page, again, I'm not going to cover everything. I do want to go down to section D, which is brought up a lot of the time as far as people want to see this in a use of force policy. So the key thing is here to note that physical force may be necessary in situations which cannot otherwise be controlled. Force may be resorted to unless other reasonable alternatives have been exhausted. So again, that's sort of this very standard language in these use of force policies. And the last sentence says verbal or physical abuse is forbidden. Okay. The next section then, section 5, resistance control guidelines. So this is what is typically called a use of force continuum. It doesn't say that in here, but it's essentially what it is a use of force continuum. And at this point, I want to check to make sure we don't have any questions here. Don't believe we do, so I'll continue on. So this use of force continuum. So you heard this a lot again this past summer. There's a call for having use of force continuums. And let me try to summarize what a use of force continuum does. So when it comes to using force, this is all governed by the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution. And the Fourth Amendment says that the force has to be reasonable. Okay, that's simple, I guess you could say, but also sort of abstract in a lot of ways. I mean, so officers have, they have pepper spray, they have a taser, they have a baton, they have a firearm, they can use their hands and fists, and there's all types of options for them. But no matter what they do, it has to always be reasonable. And so when you think about this, that's quite abstract. Just to say, well, it's got to be reasonable. So over the years, and these go back probably decades, at some point there was developed this sort of, I guess, more concrete way of like putting these things into a structure of, okay, if a citizen does this, whatever it is, then what is the response of the officer? What can the response of the officer be, knowing that it has to be reasonable? And that's where you get these use of force continuums. There's all kinds of variations of them. They can change in content or vary in content, and also the actual presentation of them. Like some of them are in a circle. Ours is more of a ladder type where you just go from one side to the other. And so I'll kind of go through this. It goes on to the next page. So if you look at the left side, that is the level of resistance for the citizen. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Psychological intimidation, verbal noncompliance, or oral refusal to comply. So this is simply the officer legally wants a citizen to do something, move over here, leave a gas station, leave someplace that they're not supposed to be. And in response to that, the citizen gives this psychological intimidation. That could be a stare, it could be sort of this glare at the officer, it could just be a complete refusal to acknowledge the officer, do anything. And so then you go to the right, and the response options for that then for the officer are they simply have officer presence. They then sort of match the psychological intimidation with officer presence. And then they can also give verbal direction. We then move on down to passive resistance. So this is ignoring the officer's commands, but making no further to resist. And then that goes into soft empty hand control for the officer, which is basically grabbing a person, sort of moving them around as would probably be common and appropriate in that circumstance. I'm going to move on to the next page, and I think we have a couple questions here. Oh, well, we got those answered. All right. Hold on just a minute here. I went too far. Okay, so continuing on with our use of force continuum. We then have defensive resistance from the citizen. We can have active aggression. That's when they're assaulting the citizen. And then we have aggravated active aggression, which is something that's likely to cause serious physical injury or death. And then those on the right-hand side, you see what the officer's responses can be to those different actions by the citizen. Now, the one key concept in this, it's sort of baked into the use of force continuum that I want to bring up to you, is that the officers are able to not only meet the citizen's level of resistance, but they can go just above that level of resistance. And if you think about this, you know, they would almost have to be that way, because if you just simply met the citizen's level of resistance, a lot of times that would end in a stalemate. And what the officer is trying to usually, in most of these circumstances, take the person into custody. Again, this is just sort of baked into this. That's sort of part of that concept of reasonableness that we started off with talking about the use of force continuum. All right, I have to move my annotations around here. So do we have any questions about the use of force continuum? I know there's a lot there with that. I don't see any questions. Okay, the next section then, somebody raised their hand. Let's see, we do have a question. To my other panelists, I'll just go ahead and read this. So here we have a question that says, what is the policy for turning on police cams? And what are the consequences when a camera is not turned on? It's pretty lengthy here. So I'll just answer this in brief about the body cams here. So that's a good question. So, you know, how do the body cams play into this? So our department does have body cams now. And so for all of this, all of the things that we're talking about here, the body cams should be on. Okay, so our policy reads that any time an officer is taking an enforcement action, or any time that they think that they're going to take an enforcement action, they should have their body cam on. So just real quick, as an example here of what that's talking about, is we have, let's say you get an officer gets a call to a gas station for someone causing a disturbance, not leaving the gas station when they're asked to. That's going to be something where the officer should know that there's a likelihood, it's not always going to happen, but there's a likelihood that there could be some enforcement action there, just by the fact that the officer is using their official authority to walk into that place and say, okay, you need to leave. That's using official authority, so they'd have to have their body cam on. So short answer to that question is body cam should be on during all of these type of situations that we're talking about here. We did have another question here. This person asks, they have a martial arts background, have concerns about both the elimination of holds that involve the neck and can be safe and effective, but at the same time require a great deal of training. What training locks and bars do you provide? Okay, so that's quite interesting that you asked that. So one of the reasons why we got rid of the choke holds and shoulder pins, all that type of stuff back, 15 years ago when we did, it wasn't because CALEA said you couldn't do it. Although that's changing. I think they're now updating it to just prohibit it. But at the time, at least, it was that if you wanted to do it, you had to train on it quite often. And so it, unfortunately, just becomes unfeasible to train a lot on that. So to this person's comment, could those things be effective? I guess in theory they could be, but again, he kind of hit the nail on the head. You have to train a lot on those to make sure you're doing it safely, and you kind of know what you're doing with that. All right, I'm going to move on here. So the next section, section 6, talks about the responsibilities of department personnel. So we go down to individual employee responsibility. So it makes very clear here that every employee is responsible to report any type of excessive force as described in this order. I will tell you that in the versions to come, the future versions of this, because of CLIA accreditation and because it's the right thing to do, we're going to have in there that you also not only have to report, but you have a duty to intervene. So it's going to be made very clear that you have to do something to, in some cases, stop what's happening. All of these are reviewed by the Bureau of Professional Standards. This is similar to internal affairs. So they're going to review all of these uses of force whenever this, we have a whole administrative system that sort of, these start in the field and they work their way through all the way to the chief of police. So there's numerous layers of review to these. All right, move on to page 4 here. So this top part here is, sorry, moving around there too fast. Top part is talking about use of force investigations. There's quite a bit of stuff here, very in the weeds as far as what to do. This is talking about, this top section is what happens when a person is shot or a gunshot wound is inflicted. It makes very clear that you have to get medical attention, and we have a whole set of reporting procedures for that. That have to be followed whenever an officer shoots at someone or shoots and hits someone. I will say that there are 2 sort of investigations going on when that happens. So we have the criminal investigation that's done by our Crimes Against Persons, and then you also have an administrative investigation done by the Bureau of Professional Standards, or what would a lot of times be called internal affairs. If we go to the next page here, there's a couple other caveats to discharging weapons. And this is sort of saying, well, you could discharge a weapon to euthanize, in most cases, a deer in St. Louis County. That happens quite often. We have a caveat here for sporting events, and then the one key thing to look at here is at the middle of the page on B2, there's a whole section here that prohibits shooting at or from moving vehicles. So again, this was sort of highlighted this last summer by a lot of groups, advocates wanting to reform use of force policy. And I will say that, I think our language in here is pretty good. If you look right in the middle of here, it even says that officers should avoid tactics that could place them in a position where a vehicle could be used as a weapon against them, i.e. reaching into a vehicle to turn the car off and secure the keys, approaching from the front of the car. So what we're saying here is officers should not create jeopardy for themselves. They shouldn't stand in front of cars. They shouldn't do things that will create a situation where the car is now a weapon going to be used against them, and then precipitate some type of deadly force situation. The next section here is the non-deadly use of force. So anything less than something that would be lethal. And we have some of the similar type provisions for that. And the one things I want to point out here, just like with the deadly force, anytime in section B here, so anytime that an officer uses force, they have to then call a supervisor to come to the scene, and that supervisor then has to do administrative investigation of that scene. Okay, so there's a hard mandate for reporting of this. This section on the next page follows that up, and it's just talking about this thorough investigation by that supervisor on scene. They have to look for witnesses. They have to make sure that there's medical treatment given to the citizen, and actually the officers have to do that as well. And then once they do that, they're going to write an administrative report, and as I mentioned earlier, that's going to go all the way through the chain of command to internal affairs, through all the commanders, all the way to the chief for review. So these are thoroughly reviewed. They're looked over many times. And now there's body cam footage that accompanies those as they go through the whole chain of command. In section C at the bottom here, I'm not going to go through all this, but this is really just clarifying what is a use of force. Okay, so that's something that we haven't talked about yet, but it's worth mentioning. So the idea here is, well, what are we actually calling a use of force? So we talk about how many uses of force and what to do if there's a use of force, but what actually is a use of force? And for our definition, it's anything outside of a normal handcuffing. So normal handcuffing, if someone complies, you put the handcuffs on the person, there's no problem there whatsoever. the person's then taken to jail or detained, whatever the case is. So anything outside of that, so the person gets a handcuff on, they pull away, the person has to be pushed to the ground, forced to the ground, that's all a use of force. The reason why I bring this up is because these definitions are not the same for every police department throughout the United States. So there's 18,000 police departments in the United States. There's probably, I won't say there's 18,000 different definitions, but there's a lot of different definitions for what is force and when you report force. The implication of that is then it becomes very difficult to compare agencies across the United States because of all these different standards, because we're not really comparing apples to apples. And that's a bigger picture question that can be discussed another time, but there does need to be maybe some standardization of this so you can compare different departments across the United States or even locally compare them. All right, just checking the questions here. I think we've got all these. All right, let's move on to the next page. The next page doesn't have much we need to probably get into detail about here. This is just talking about required police components, what needs to be in the report. This is just some administrative stuff here. I do want to go to page 8. So page 8, it's going to talk about what happens if an employee has a use of force off duty, if they're outside of St. Louis County. But the main part I want to cover on page 8, and it goes into page 9, is the psychological support program. So our department requires that if you're involved in a lethal force situation, and this is kind of broadly defined, it's not that you have to fire a gun. It's on purpose, it's very broadly defined because it's hard to say what would affect someone psychologically. But the intent here is that if a person is involved in a highly traumatic event, whatever that may be, that they get placed on administrative leave, and then they have to go see a counselor. And then before they can come back to duty, they have to go see another counselor. That is the department counselor psychologist. And on the top of page 9, it says on E that the interview with the psychologist is used to determine if the employee is psychologically fit to return to duty. So that is something that we always have done, or well, not always, but probably for at least 20 years, where if you're involved in one of these critical incidents, it's mandatory that you have to go see a counselor, and then you have to be evaluated by the department doctor to make sure that you are fit for duty. All right, so this is the end of the policy. So just if you're wondering, we have all of our CALEA references down here, and then the chief that enacted this, and then the board. So I want to go to our questions here real quick to make sure that we've got all these before we move on. So let's see. I'll start with this one. What is the reason for firing a full magazine into a subject? We were taught in the military of muzzle discipline. It seems that officers are just emptying their mags. Yeah, it looks like Sergeant Nichols is typing an answer to that, but I'll just chime in real quick. Yeah, well, I don't have a specific answer to that other than the officers are not, they're not trained to just empty the whole mag. They're trained to stop the threat. Next question is there a chain of custody when a person has been shot and the supervisor has to look into and so forth for each person has to review? Yes, there is. Short answer to that. So the administrative system we have is all electronic, and so at what stage it is whenever it goes through the whole chain of command. Okay. Next one is, how long is de-escalation training? And upon the periodic review of use of force policy, how the reviews administered in the police department? Okay, so the de-escalation training. So the answer to how long is it, it varies. We've had different types of de-escalation training over the years, so there's not one standard answer to that. I will say there's a recent development in that the Missouri Secretary of State just issued an emergency, I guess you could say, order. I don't know if that's the official term for it, but he did issue an order in October, stating that starting January 1st, 2021, all commission officers have to go through de-escalation training and implicit bias training every year. So that will be more standardized as we move forward, at least in the state of Missouri. And the periodic reviews of the use of force policy. So with that, my colleagues in my work unit every year sit down and go through the policy, and we're constantly sort of looking at the state of affairs in these policies throughout the United States. You know, as far as the use of the reviews, how they're administered, it's a little, I guess you could say, subjective as far as it's sort of our call as to when you need to update these. We've clearly decided we need to update this one just because a lot has changed here recently, and we feel like it's time that we make some of these things much more clear and explicit in these policies, not to mention the fact that we have some new CALIA standards coming out. Okay, we have another question. Says, I come from a healthcare background where continuing education certification are a regular occurrence. Related to law enforcement, I'm thinking of individual certification in particular techniques and regulations, continuing education, mental health concerns, cultural aspects, and language barriers. Yeah, I would agree. We, in law enforcement in the state of Missouri, have to have 24 hours of continuing education every year. So we do work on that. We do some of those things similar to healthcare. And let's see. Looks like Kim is typing in an answer for one of these. Is there a policy that covers what information will be released and when officer involved shootings? So I'm assuming that's talking about information being released for officer involved shootings. Is there a policy for that? Well, the policy in short is that a lot of this is Missouri Sunshine Law. And so since it is an open investigation, we typically don't release that information. And that kind of gets into this whole issue of, do you release the internal records of officers, sort of their internal affairs records, all that? And the answer to that is typically no, because in Missouri, those are personal records and those are closed records. So that's really a state law issue. You may see in other states that they release the names of officers, and it's always curious to me. A lot of times it does depend on state law. So it could be that the state mandates it. So short answer is we go by the state law. All right, I'm going to move on to what I'm calling outcomes. So I'm going to share with you an abbreviated version of what we have. We have the annual Bureau of Professional Standards report. So CALIA mandates that we write this report every year, and it covers really anything that our internal affairs handles throughout the year. And that's a whole lot of things. It's citizen complaints, it's vehicle pursuits, it's vehicle accidents, it's use of force. For this presentation, I'm only going to cover the use of force. I'm not going to go through all of the other items on here. But I will tell you that if you want to see this whole thing, this too is on our department website. This is the second page of it, first page actually, showing where all these things are at, these different policies. So if you're curious about this whole report, whatever I'm covering today or the whole thing in its entirety, please go to the website and you can review this. So just real quickly here, we'll go over some of the things covered in this. So figure 3 up here has a use of force incidents, this is for our department, of course, throughout the last 5 years. So we have 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. The numbers are fairly consistent. We're below 300 every year. And this is typically what you'd see. If you would go back in time, let's say you go back to 2010, you're going to see something very similar to this. It may have been over 300 for a few years there, 2011, 12. The one thing to point out here is that these are incidents. So if you're kind of into the stats and into counting these things, I will tell you that when you're talking about an incident, that's a different accounting method than the actual counts of force. Okay, and that's the distinction you see then if you go down to the table 6 below it, where you see all these firearm discharges and baton and less lethal and canine, and you see all these different categories. And then you go down to the very bottom and you look at the totals, and you're probably saying to yourself, well, how can it be that, you know, you had 569 uses of force in 2019, but above it says you had 268? Well, the reason for that is the accounting methods. So when we're talking about the top chart there, that's incidents. So for example, Sergeant Nichols and I, we could go on a call and I could use one type of force, let's say a taser, and Sergeant Nichols uses, maybe he tackles a person and then uses a baton. So that's one incident. Both of us were there. We both used, at least he used two different types of force. I used one type of force. That's still just one incident. But then how that would work its way out in the table below is we now have a tally mark, so to speak, for baton, physical restraint, and also taser. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody, that the table below is really a more detailed version of breaking all of these things out from one single incident. But nevertheless, if we look at these over the years, again, we're pretty consistent. I will note here that if you look at taser use throughout the years, we go from 165, 153, 119, 103 to 78. So we have really reduced the use of taser. That was a conscious effort that we introduced some training on that. Just so we felt that the taser was, we were kind of keeping track of this and noticing that there was a pretty high incidence of taser use. So again, that was deliberate. We're trying to get that taser use down. So there's some court cases that came out that sort of curtailed the use of it. So we had to react to that, and the training worked as we would hope it would. Going to the next page then, this looks at these uses of force by the work element. So this is a huge table, we got a lot of information in here, but it just is going through to monitor, you know, what different work units use force by year, and you can see if there's any abnormalities in that, if anything's increasing, decreasing, what the case is. So that's really it. Again, it was an abbreviated version of that report. If you would like to look at the whole thing, you can go online and see that. Looks like we have some questions here, so I'll go ahead and look at these before we go on to the comment section. All right, so first question here is, got a little bit of a preamble. Is it correct to say that no citizens are involved in critical incident reviews? Yes, that is correct. And if a critical review is to be done in a municipality, who does the review? Well, it depends on what you call a review. So to answer Jeff's question here, if we investigate a critical incident in a municipality, we are doing the criminal investigation of that incident. However, the St. Louis County Police Department doesn't do an administrative one. So anything administrative, that has to be done by the municipality, but that's a good question. All right, let's see, what else do we have here? Let's see, I think Kim's got some of these. The only other question here maybe is, there's a question by Anthony, are these statistics broken out by ethnicity and gender? And they are not in this report, but they can be. It's a good question. And we do monitor those things. Got another question that just came in. Does the number of incidents refer to those reported and investigated, or just reported? Okay, so if they are reported, then they're investigated. So it includes both. So to answer this question, if there is a use of force incident, so if an officer says, I had a use of force, that automatically gets investigated. All right, so let's go next to the public comment. All right. Let's see. So remember, for the public comment, you can continue to ask your questions using the Q&A, or you can raise your hand. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. You can raise your hand and then I can unmute you and you are able to talk. All right, so looks like we have Darral Johnson. Mr. Johnson, you should be unmuted. Let's see, no, you're not. There we go. Okay, I can hear you now.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Yes, go ahead, sir.
I'm concerned. First of all, I'm concerned about a policy for mental health situations. Those who have serious mental health problems, and normally the family or whoever, you know, is out of their control, and they call the police for help. And many times, that help is not as helpful as they would have wished. So, my first question would be, would there be, well, I shouldn't ask a question. I should be making a comment that there need to be overall revision on the policy. I don't know if there was one in the past, but there needs to be overall revision considering mental health individuals and the use of force. Um, the second thing I wanted to say was I look at this policy, and it looks very abstract in many cases, and it gives a lot of leeway for the officer. I truly believe that there needs to be some tightening up, if you will, of this policy to the point that it doesn't give officers leeway, a lot of leeway as far as uh, using a taser, using a gun instead of a taser, or uh, uh, doing just thinking off the spur, but thinking some uh, wrong things that results in lethal force. I think those two things that really need to be worked on in the policy, mental health, and tightening up the where the officer doesn't have so much leeway on what do I use uh, uh, regarding the policy. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yeah. Just make it more clear and explicit of when you can do things and when you can't do things. Is that kind
Right,
of what you're saying? Okay.
right, right.
Okay. All right. Well,
Uh,
thank you. I appreciate the comment.
Thank you.
All right. Next, we have Jeff. Jeff, let's see. Make sure you're unmuted. I believe you're unmuted now.
All right, thank you.
Problem.
And I'd like to thank you, Colby, and everyone involved in the St. Louis County Police for holding this dialogue. It's a good effort, and I appreciate you seeking input. It's a great idea.
Yeah,
Thank you.
my
So,
pleasure.
my review, and I've done some review of use of force policies. I live in Richmond Heights, and I've talked with leaders there, the chief and the mayor, city council, done a bit the same here in now reviewing county policy. I think we're in a good place, and a lot of the use of force policies as they're written, whether there's too much leeway or not, can be debated. I think there is a lot of leeway. It may be necessary, but my biggest concern is transparency. And today, the thing that concerns me most is there's an awful lot of burden put on the police. You're being asked to do too much. And one of the things that police are being asked to do exclusively is review the critical incidents. There is no citizen input. There's no transparency, therefore. So when there is a critical incident, it's reviewed, I know, by the county prosecutor, but only by the police. I point everyone towards Salt Lake City as an example. They have a three-pronged approach for review of critical incident. Police review it, administration reviews it, and a citizen review board reviews it. The burden should be on the citizens on how we police ourselves, not solely on the police. So My concern with transparency sounds like I would think that police are misusing their review. They could. They're the ones in power protecting their power, but it's also too much of a burden to ask the police to police themselves. There should be citizen review. That's my only comment, only thing I'd like to see us improve upon. Thank you again for hearing us.
Yeah, thank you for the comments. All right, let's see. We have Christi would like to talk. Trying to unmute you here. Okay, Christi,
Okay,
you're on.
Okay, thank you again for hosting this. I appreciate the opportunity to hear you review the policy. I want to repeat my question, however, about the consequences when officers violate the policies, because we have seen policies across the country that are repeatedly violated with no consequences move within the department. The only remedy left for the citizen is via the state is to file a lawsuit. And we so often find that no matter how egregious the behavior, how clear the video, the officer is acquitted. What is done internally when officers choose to violate the policies?
Yeah, so, I think one thing to point out here, which is kind of, I guess I'll say, a little bit hidden by the sunshine law that I mentioned earlier, is that there actually are officers who are disciplined. We've fired officers over the years for inappropriate use of force, and we do have people who are disciplined and fired for using inappropriate force. I suppose that maybe flies under the radar a little bit, but I don't have a great answer for you other than we do that, and all of these things are reviewed, and we have quite a few, I guess, incidents where these things are or do end up in discipline termination.
Is it possible to make public a general report at the end of the year so that the public does know that discipline has occurred?
I don't know the answer to that question right now, but I will look into that. I think what you're talking about, LA County Sheriff does something similar to that.
Right, that would probably help a lot, especially considering the last question and talking about transparency and accountability for the public to know that actions are being taken. It's really disheartening when these lawsuits end up with acquittals to think that nothing has taken place. So thank you for your response. I appreciate it.
All right, no problem. Thank you. Okay, we have Pierre would like to comment. All right, go ahead, sir.
Good morning. Thank you for having this discussion again. I think it's a very relevant discussion here. But one question I did have was in reference to police academy training, because that's where officers get the brunt of their training from to sort of, allow them to be able to become police officers. What in the police academy, what reviews or what updates are there on use of force training? Because that's really where it begins. Where do they get their training from in reference to use of force? So, has there been any changes, updates with those particular type of policies starting from the beginning?
Yeah, so the amount of hours that they get is kind of static. That's determined by the state. So the state of Missouri says how many hours of each topic you have to get in the academy, generally speaking. There's very little sort of wiggle room with that. As far as the content, I do know that our police academy tries to keep up on the latest standards and the latest sort of trends. But yeah, as far as the specifics of that content, I don't have that. I can follow up, and if you leave your contact information, I can get you those answers probably.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll do that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Sara, let's see. All right, Sara, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. Good morning. I'd like to also thank everyone for holding this session and reiterate that I think transparency is key to this. And I think all of us can agree that policing is a tough job, and as it comes under greater scrutiny these days, that it's easy for us to play Monday morning quarterback after we see either videos or hear situations. One of the things that concerns me, though, and maybe you can help answer, in a situation where it seems, and this is based off footage that's later released, it seems that maybe the situation has de-escalated, or that the perpetrator now has their back turned. And a lot of times that's where I see frustration, where I feel like, okay, there could have been something. Has the situation changed, or the severity changed, where maybe lethal force could have been considered in the beginning, but it's no longer? So I'm thinking of situations where there's now multiple police officers, or where the person now has their back turned, where the threat doesn't seem as imminent. Are there processes in place, or what are some things that could maybe alternately be done in situations like that, where it may have started off but now has de-escalated?
Yeah, so I understand your point. That's been a long-standing issue. Going back, I'll go back to the days when I taught at our police academy. It's a little bit of human psychology and physiology, I guess, is that once a person sort of focuses on a threat, and then the heart rate increases, they have an adrenaline dump, it's then hard to back down off of that. Now, not that that's a reason to continue with force when you shouldn't use it, but I don't have a good answer to that, other than saying that's something that's recognized in training, and it's a constant battle of trying to come up with ways to combat that. Does it kind of make sense?
It does. Okay. No, it does. And I'm a nurse as well. So I get the adrenaline dump and the rush. It's just, I think, disheartening when, like I said, you're standing here after the fact and watching a video. We said, wow, that could have turned out so much differently had, it seems to have de-escalated, especially when there's more officers on scene. And that's just where I was, and I'm sure it's tough to get your mindset to change when you feel that there was a threat that started out more severely, but has gone to. So
yeah, and actually, I think Sergeant Nichols, if you could unmute yourself, and maybe could you talk about some of the active bystandership training, because I think that's maybe where this plays a role.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
So you have a great question. I think part of that is Lieutenant was correct in saying that adrenaline dumping is happening, and that person may need to be redirected by their fellow officers and supervisors that are on scene. Especially if you have several officers there, they can get that officer away from that particular situation and continue to allow that de-escalation to happen. Officers, we're really looking into holding ourselves accountable and transition to more of an active bystandership, where we would address not just being passive, we would continue to mitigate situations like that and step in and ensure that citizens do not get harmed, as well as officers don't go down a track because of those adrenaline dumping and focus, that they would bring harm and lose their careers and those such things. So we'll continue to work on that, and we should have some information in regards to that soon.
I appreciate that, and I think that's a great idea, and especially once other officers arrive on scene, to make it sort of a group effort to alleviate the situation as best as possible. So thank you for that answer.
All right, thank you. Okay, let's see here. Victoria, go ahead with your comment.
Thanks for taking my question, my comment today. I've really appreciated this whole conversation that we're having today. And I wanted to follow up on something that Mr. Davis said, and also Ms. Owens, my nursing colleague, and Sergeant Nichols, about this adrenaline dump issue and the training. I might be mistaken, but I think that in recent years anyway, a lot of new police officers, or a lot of officers who are new to the force, maybe haven't gone through the academy. Instead, they've come out of the military and they've gotten some sort of a credit for their military training. And And I think that, from my perspective, that training might be very different. As far as in the military, a person is trained to set aside their inhibitions to killing or harming another person, and to just shoot everybody and let God sort it out. But then in a traditional general academy, I think maybe the teaching is different. And I'm wondering what happens when someone comes out of the military, which, yeah, and I have total respect for military, appreciate him. My husband's a veteran. But what is there any specific training that goes into that military veteran turning into a civilian police officer? Is there any specific training that helps them to address these kinds of issues differently?
Yeah, so in a second, I'm going to turn it over to Sergeant Nichols. He's got some relevant experience with this, but from my vantage point of being an instructor in the police academy, I do know that there, as far as specific training, there's not like a course or a lesson plan for it, but I do know that there's a lot of reorienting people to, this is policing in a democracy, which is different than being in combat, than being in another country doing whatever your operation is. So that was definitely emphasized. Now, depends on the person. You know, some people, they adapt very well. Others are a little bit more slow to change their mindset. But I do know that that is something that is addressed, maybe not formally as you're suggesting, though. Sergeant Nichols, did you want to chime in on this?
Yes, I would say that our military veterans are trained in rules of engagement. Before they go in theater or anything of that nature, they are given the rules and understand what they are supposed to do. They are still accountable for any round that they shoot that does not meet those rules through the Geneva Convention. When they transition over into local law enforcement, like LT said, they are getting a real in-depth schooling on the Constitution and the laws locally, and how they are to interact as law enforcement officers. Some of the training does translate as far as weapon discipline and all of those particular things. But really, what you have is officers identifying that there are certain local laws, state as well as federal, that they must operate under. So we see a lot of success. There are challenges, obviously, with some of our veterans as well as regular officers, and we're working out ways in which we can bring those things to light. But as far as rules of engagement, just locally in our veterans, they do an excellent job of just operating in those high intensity risk reward type situations. So yes, we'll continue to look at that, and would continue to train them as well as to ensure that they have the correct counseling or anything else that may bring harm to our citizens.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. All right, we have Lisa who would like to comment. Lisa, you should be unmuted now.
Okay, thank you so much. I was, well, I'm appreciative of all of the things I'm learning today, particularly about upcoming training, additional training requirements in de-escalation and anti-bias. I wonder if there are any other kind of active initiatives within St. Louis County to help reduce the need for the use of force.
Yeah, I would say, well, there's a lot of different ways you could approach this, start off with. So what are we doing to reduce the need for use of force? So there's a lot of different avenues again. One is we have expanded our crisis intervention team unit. That's officers dedicated to dealing with individuals with mental health problems. We also then are considering doing this active bystandership that Sergeant Nichols discussed. Mm-hmm. And then there's also, this is very generalized, but there's just kind of a much broader awareness of this in general throughout the department. And part of it is frankly because of all the media attention. I mean, it's just, there's a lot more scrutiny. There's a lot more attention that's brought to this. And I think that that does actually probably mitigate some of this stuff in the end.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Thank you. Okay, do we have any other hands raised or any other questions? I don't see any. Let's see. So I will just follow up by saying that Mr. Davis asked about the academy training and what's being done to update that, knowing that a lot of the officers base their decisions and what they do in the field off of their initial academy training. So I will follow up on that. And I saw your email in the question and answer section, and I saw that another person wanted that too. So I will send that out when I obtain that, and I don't see any other hands raised. So I will go ahead and wrap this up. Actually, Sarah, I think one more person wants to talk. Sarah, did you want to say something?
I just had my question on there, but are there other committees or community boards that we can participate in to continue this kind of dialogue, or we can be a part of on an ongoing basis?
You know, off the top of my head, I know that the Violence Prevention Council out of WashU, at least it started out of WashU, they talk about these type of issues quite often.
Violence Prevention Council?
Yeah, VPC is usually what they go by.
Okay, thank you.
All right, no problem. Okay, again, I don't see any other hands being raised, and I think our questions are slowing down here, or at least they're all answered. So I want to thank everyone. Oh, one more. Let's see. Timothy. Just, where'd you go here? Well, I thought I saw Timothy. Timothy, did you want to talk? Nope. Don't see him on here. Okay, if I don't get anyone else, then listen, I want to sincerely thank everybody for participating. I thought this was great as far as my end. You know, I hope everybody got something out of it, maybe learned a little bit, learned about the use of force policy, how things are done in police departments. And my hope is that we can continue doing these webinars, not just for use of force issues, but for whatever the policy may be in the future that really affects the public. So again, thank you. And if you have further comments, please send them to policycomment@stlouisco.com, and we will answer them from there. So thank you.